The elderly man was living his golden years happily with his dog until, suddenly, a tragedy struck them both. What the dog did for the old man will leave you amazed. "Ready, Skye?" Charles's soft voice broke the peaceful morning silence as he bent down with some effort to pet the golden fur of his loyal friend. Skye, a golden retriever with bright, attentive eyes, perked up his ears and wagged his tail eagerly, as if he understood every word. Charles, a white-haired man with rough hands from years of labor, always found peace in these moments. Widowed for years with no close family, his world revolved around Skye and the lush fields surrounding his home. They lived in a remote corner of Mexico, a place where time seemed to pass more slowly and life was simpler. In that simplicity, Charles found a deep, quiet happiness shared only with his furry friend. Each morning was the same, and this comforting routine brought him a unique sense of peace. "Come on, buddy, let's go for a walk," Charles would say, watching as Skye bounded ahead, jumping through the grass, sniffing the fresh air, and marking his territory along the bushes. Walking through the countryside had become a shared routine, a quiet ritual they both cherished without needing any words. To Charles, Skye was more than just a companion. He was the last link that tied him to life. With every step beside his dog, Charles felt a gentle, yet steady comfort. A reminder that even though his wife was no longer by his side, he wasn't entirely alone. After their walks, they always stopped at the top of a small hill. From there, the view was breathtaking. Endless fields of green and gold stretching as far as the eye could see, bordered by distant blue mountains. The afternoon sun would dip slowly, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. Charles often stood in silence, squinting, enjoying the warmth of the sun on his face. Skye would sit beside him, still and watchful, almost as if he too understood the beauty of the moment. In those peaceful times, Charles would sometimes recall his youth, the days when he was young and strong, with his wife by his side and life filled with laughter and hard work. Now, his world moved at a slower pace, but Skye's presence made him feel he still had a reason to wake up each morning. He knew his dog understood him in ways no person ever could. On nights when the weight of his years felt heavier, Skye would curl up at his feet, offering warmth and comfort that no words could provide. "You know, Skye," Charles would murmur, stroking the dog's head. "Sometimes it feels like you're all I have left in this world. Without you, this place would feel empty, like a house without light." Skye would look up at his owner with those loyal eyes, as if he understood every word. In truth, they didn't need to speak. They shared a connection that went beyond words, a bond deeper than human expression. One evening, as they watched the sunset together, Charles sighed deeply, feeling a faint ache in his chest, a twinge he had felt before but always ignored. "We're getting old, aren't we, buddy?" he said to Skye, attempting a smile, though there was a trace of sadness in his voice. Skye just looked at him, tilting his head, as if to say that it didn't matter how many years passed. He would always be there, faithful and alert. Skye watched Charles with a profound gaze, his tail moving slowly, as if he understood that the weight of years had begun to bear down on his friend. That evening, as they returned down the hill where they often watched the sunsets, they made their way back to the small house. Charles, though quiet, dragged his feet a bit more than usual. Skye walked beside him, alert, almost in sync, sensing that something in the air had shifted. The next day, in the fresh, tranquil morning, Charles decided to go out for a walk with Skye, just like every day. The sun was just beginning to rise, and the sky was clear, with clouds drifting lazily over the hills. Reaching the dirt path, Charles felt a tingling in his chest, but tried to ignore it, breathing deeply and patting Skye on the head. "Let's go, buddy. Nice and slow," he murmured, as Skye looked at him with bright eyes, ready to follow any command his owner gave him. They walked along the winding path until they reached a small clearing. Skye sniffed around the grass and nearby bushes when, suddenly, Charles stopped in his tracks. At the end of the path, a truck was speeding toward them. Skye, curious about the noise, lifted his head, watching without understanding. But in an instant, Charles, driven by instinct, rushed forward to push his friend out of harm's way. "Skye!" he shouted with all his might, reaching out a hand to his dog as the truck hurtled toward them. With one swift motion, he managed to push Skye out of the way, but there was no time for him to dodge the impact himself. The noise was deafening. The truck screeched to a halt, and the driver rushed out to where Charles had fallen, still and motionless in the dust. Skye, not fully understanding what had just happened, ran back to his friend, nudging Charles's body with his nose, whimpering softly. He licked his face, barked, trying to get his owner to wake up. Unable to comprehend why he wasn't responding, the townsfolk, alerted by the commotion, quickly gathered. Some called for an ambulance, while others tried to calm Skye, who wouldn't stop barking or nudging Charles's arm, hoping he would move. When the paramedics arrived, a few neighbors held Skye back, allowing them to take Charles to the hospital. Skye growled, struggling to break free, his desperation clear in his panicked, sorrowful eyes. Eventually, one of the neighbors took him back to Charles's house and locked him inside to keep him from following the ambulance. The days that followed were tough for Skye. In the house that had once been his sanctuary, the emptiness was almost palpable. Skye sat by the door, listening intently for any sound, hoping every moment that Charles would return. Every time someone approached the door, Skye jumped up with excitement, only for his hope to fade when he realized it wasn't Charles. At night, he paced back and forth, softly whining in his confusion. Sometimes, exhausted, he would lie down beside Charles's favorite chair, hoping to catch a hint of his scent or the sound of his voice. But as each day passed, the emptiness grew heavier, and a deep sadness began to fill the air. He barely touched his food, and his once bright eyes grew dull and weary. The neighbors tried to comfort him, stopping by occasionally to offer him food, but Skye barely glanced at them. They, too, missed Charles. He was a beloved figure in the community, but they knew Skye's grief was unique. Those who knew Charles well understood the profound, almost human bond he shared with Skye, a connection built on looks and gestures. That bond was now broken, leaving a void that no one else could fill. Days passed, and Skye, weaker and more despondent, began to refuse even water. Yet a glimmer of hope would still light up his eyes whenever he heard any noise at the threshold. No one could soothe the sadness in his gaze, and though the neighbors did their best, their efforts weren't enough. Somehow, Skye seemed to know his fate was intertwined with Charles's, and that without him nothing in the world made sense. That night, as heavy rain fell and thunder rumbled in the distance, Skye felt an unrest he couldn't shake. The neighbors had locked up the house, but the cold, damp air carried a sense that he couldn't just stay there, waiting in vain. The memory of Charles grew stronger with each raindrop hitting the window. His image seemed to pulse in Skye's mind, urging him to find him before it was too late. Somehow, in the darkness, Skye managed to open a small gap in the window. With the wind howling and the rain soaking his fur, he slipped out of the house, stepping onto the wet ground with determined but cautious steps. Though exhausted and weakened, a fierce resolve filled his heart. giving him the strength to press on. The weariness didn't matter. Every step felt like it brought him closer to Charles, or at least, that's what he hoped. The rain was icy, and the chill seeped into his bones, but none of that stopped him. The path to the hospital was unclear. Skye could only vaguely recall the smells and sounds of the streets he'd once walked with his owner. The storm worsened by the minute, and the usually quiet streets now felt like unknown labyrinths, filled with puddles and shadows. As he moved, Skye remembered the morning walks with Charles, the moments they'd spent exploring the town's edges together. They had walked through some main streets, and the sense of nearby shops gave him a bit of comfort. With each new smell, Skye tried to recall the right path, moving faster despite the growing fatigue in his legs. Suddenly, a car sped by, splashing mud and water onto his already soaked fur. Skye shivered, struggling to shake off the water. His paws slipped on the wet ground, and for a moment he felt the urge to stop, to find shelter under a ledge somewhere, and rest. But the image of Charles, alone and unwell, gave him the strength he needed to keep going. He couldn't, no, he wouldn't, stop now. In the distance, the city lights reflected off the puddles, and Skye began to recognize some familiar landmarks. The bakery, where the scent of fresh bread filled the morning air, the plaza with its wooden benches, and up ahead, the pharmacy where Charles used to buy his medicines. Skye pressed forward, ignoring the relentless rain, driven only by love and loyalty to his friend. Midway through his journey, his strength started to falter. The lack of food and water made him feel weaker by the moment, and his legs shook under his own weight. Pausing briefly beneath the awning of a closed shop, he tried to catch his breath. But just then, he heard a familiar sound. A memory of Charles's voice, warm and full of affection, calling his name. It was as if the echo of his owner's voice whispered in his ear, urging him to continue. "Skye, where are you, buddy?" The memory was so vivid, so real, that Skye felt a surge of energy. Without a second thought, he was back on the road, abandoning any thought of rest and facing the storm once more. The path to the hospital was uncertain, but he trusted his instincts to lead him there. Charles had always believed in him, and Skye couldn't let him down now. Skye's search took him farther than he had ever gone. As he moved forward, the surroundings transformed into something unfamiliar. The trees grew thicker, their shadows enveloping the path as if trying to trap every trace of light. The forest, with its tangled branches and the wind rustling through the leaves, seemed hostile, foreign, and dark. Every whisper of the trees held a hidden mystery. Skye sniffed the air, hoping for a sign, something to tell him he was on the right path to Charles. But in the dim light of the forest, every scent became muddled, and every sound made him second-guess. Hunger and thirst had begun to sap his strength, and his paws, covered in mud and scrapes, started to tremble. Yet, there wasn't a single thought of stopping. His love for Charles drove him to keep moving forward, even though his body cried out for rest. Suddenly, a sharp noise in the bushes alerted Skye. He turned his head and saw, through the gloom, the bright eyes of a wolf watching him intently. The wolf, large and lean, advanced slowly, its movements careful and calculated, its eyes locked on Skye. For a moment, fear gripped Skye. He knew that, in his current condition, facing a wolf could be his end. But instead of backing down, Skye stood his ground. He growled, baring his teeth, ears up, and eyes fixed firmly on the predator. The wolf hesitated, but seeing Skye's determination, let out a fierce growl and began circling him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Skye, aware that one wrong move could cost him his life, followed the wolf's every step, slowly backing up until he found an opening between the trees. With an act of courage and the last bit of strength he had, Sky ran with all his might toward the escape, dodging branches and roots jutting from the ground. He felt the wolf's breath behind him, drawing closer, but he didn't look back. He knew his only option was to escape and keep going. After a frantic dash, Sky finally managed to outrun the wolf. His legs shook. His breathing was rapid and shallow. Exhausted, he collapsed in a clearing in the forest, unable to take another step. His body trembled from the exertion and fear, but his spirit remained alive. He hadn't run just for himself, but to find Charles. Soon after, as he felt his strength fading, a gentle sound caught his attention. Faint voices and the soft tinkling of bells echoed through the foliage. With great effort, he lifted his head and made out the figure of a boy, a young shepherd with a flock of sheep. The boy, with dark hair and tanned skin, looked on in surprise at the sight of such a worn-out, weak dog in the middle of the forest. "What are you doing here, buddy?" the boy said softly, approaching cautiously. Seeing that Sky could barely move, he crouched down to pet him, noticing the sadness and exhaustion in his eyes. Sky, tired but still alert, allowed the boy to touch him, feeling the relief of a warm and gentle hand. For the first time in days, a glimmer of hope sparked inside him. Understanding that Sky needed help, the boy gently picked him up and carried him to a small shelter on the hill. There, he offered him water and a bit of bread while watching him curiously. Sky drank eagerly, feeling the cool water soothe his throat and bring a bit of strength back into his body. That night, under the boy's care, Sky finally slept in peace. His dreams took him back to happy times with Charles, remembering their walks and the sunsets over the mountains. At dawn, Sky opened his eyes to find the boy beside him, gently petting him. "You're looking for someone, aren't you?" the boy asked, sensing that this dog wasn't lost without a reason. "They say an older man was taken to the hospital. He might be your owner." Sky looked at him, a spark of hope in his eyes, as if he understood every word. The boy smiled, and without hesitation, decided to help him find his way to the hospital. "Don't worry, buddy. I'll take you to the path," the boy said, putting on his hat and tightening the strap on his satchel. "From there, you'll go on alone, but I know you'll find him." With patience, the boy guided Sky to the edge of the forest, giving him clear directions to help him find his way. Sky looked at him with gratitude, his body still tired, but his heart filled with renewed strength. As they parted, the boy gave Sky one last pat on the head and whispered, "Be careful. He's waiting for you." Understanding that the boy had given him one last chance to find Charles, Sky set out once more, his strength renewed. Though the road was still uncertain and his steps slow, the thought of his owner pushed him forward. Sky walked the streets around the hospital, scanning every corner, looking for an entrance or some way to get inside without being noticed. His fur, dirty and worn, mirrored the fatigue of the long search, and his eyes, once full of life, now showed a deep desperation. He knew Charles was nearby, so close he could almost feel his presence, but the hospital's tall gates and cold walls were a barrier he couldn't overcome. With a hesitant step, Sky approached the main gate, nudging the bars with his nose, and began to bark. His barks weren't loud, but filled with a mix of anguish and pleading, a desperate call for someone to hear him, to let him in. It wasn't long before the guards noticed him. One of them, looking tired and a bit annoyed, came over, giving Sky a dismissive look. "What are you doing here, dog? Get lost! You can't come in here," the guard said, waving his hands to shoo him away. Sky stepped back a bit but didn't leave. He looked at the guard with sad, pleading eyes, as if trying to tell him that he wasn't just a stray. Behind those doors was the only person in the world who meant anything to him. But the guard didn't seem to understand his desperation. Time passed slowly, and Sky, clinging to hope, settled himself right in front of the gate, waiting for someone else to come along, someone who might understand that he needed to get inside. Nurses and patients passing by glanced at him, some with curiosity, others with sympathy, but none offered help. In one last attempt, Sky began barking louder, his voice echoing into the quiet night. It was a call from the depths of his soul, a desperate plea born from his heart. Each bark grew sharper, more intense. His eyes, red from exhaustion, gleaming with the faint hope that someone would recognize his pain. The echo of Sky's barks traveled down the hospital halls, a sound that seemed to come from deep within, carrying all the anguish and love he had built up on his long journey. In his room, half asleep and weak, Charles felt that sound like a gentle touch on his soul. In his dreams, he seemed to recognize that unmistakable bark, as if a part of him knew that his faithful friend was close after all the time and hardships. "Sky?" Charles whispered, barely moving his lips. He felt his heart race, despite his weakness, as though that glimmer of hope revived a bit of the strength he had lost. With effort, he looked toward the door, wishing that somehow this dream could be real. The doctors and nurses surrounding him noticed his restlessness and tried to calm him, but he was insistent, pointing toward the door. "Let him in. My dog is here," he said, his voice shaky but determined. At first, the doctors hesitated, thinking his plea was just feverish confusion, but Charles's eyes held a clarity and strength they hadn't seen before. Moved, one of the nurses stepped out into the hall, where Sky, exhausted but determined, continued to bark and scratch at the door with his worn paws. With a gentle smile, the nurse looked at Sky and motioned for the guard to open the gate. "Let him in. It looks like he's got an important appointment," the nurse said warmly, and even in his exhausted state, Sky seemed to understand her kindness. As soon as the door opened, he didn't hesitate for a second. With his last bit of strength, he bolted down the hallway, following the familiar scent of Charles, an aroma he had clung to in his memory and heart every step of his journey. The hospital's cold white lights didn't faze him. Each step brought him closer to his friend, reminding him that his love and loyalty had overcome every obstacle. Finally, Sky reached the door to Charles's room. Without waiting, he darted inside, where Charles was waiting with open arms. The moment Sky saw him, he rushed to his side, jumping up onto the bed and nestling his head under the old man's hand, just as he used to when seeking a comforting touch. Charles, tears in his eyes and a weak but genuine smile, wrapped him in a hug, gently stroking his damp, matted fur. "My Sky, I knew you'd come," Charles murmured, letting his tears flow freely, while Sky rested his head on the old man's chest, whimpering softly, as if he wanted to tell him everything that had happened to bring him here. Man and dog stayed that way, in silence, sharing a moment filled with unspoken words, stories, and emotions that needed no explanation. It was as if time had paused just for them, allowing them to savor that reunion after so much uncertainty and hardship. The nurse and doctors, watching from the door, stood quietly, respecting the special bond between them. They had witnessed many things in the hospital, but rarely anything as powerful and moving as this reunion. To them, it was clear that this dog and his owner shared a connection that went beyond understanding, a loyalty and love that had kept them both alive and hopeful. As the minutes passed, Charles, comforted by Sky's presence, began to regain a bit of energy. His hands, once weak, now rested softly on Sky's fur, and his breathing, though still unsteady, became calmer. "Thank you, my friend. Thank you for coming for me," he whispered, and Sky, as if he understood every word, lifted his head and licked his hand, responding with a silent affection that spoke louder than any words. The nurse approached gently, careful not to disrupt the moment, but knowing that Charles needed rest. Kneeling beside the bed, she spoke softly. "It's important that you get some sleep, Charles. Sky can stay right here by your side, if you'd like." Charles nodded, never taking his eyes off his loyal friend, as though afraid that closing his eyes might make Sky disappear. But Sky, understanding the importance of rest, settled himself next to the bed, determined not to leave his friend's side. That night, for the first time in a long while, they both rested in peace. Sky, with his muzzle resting on the edge of the bed, drifted into sleep, knowing he had completed his mission, that his search was over, and he was finally back with Charles. In his dreams, he relived the happy times they had shared together, their walks through the countryside, the quiet afternoons on the hill, and the sound of Charles's laughter, which now, even in his memories, echoed like a warm melody. The days following Charles and Sky's reunion at the hospital saw an almost miraculous recovery. Charles, who had arrived in an extremely weakened state, began to improve at a pace that surprised the doctors and hospital staff. His once weary face brightened each time Sky curled up by his side. The doctors exchanged astonished glances, quietly marveling at how the love and loyalty of a faithful dog could become such a powerful force, able to challenge exhaustion and pain alike. Sky never left his side, providing his owner with the encouragement he needed to keep going. Charles, still frail, woke each morning with a smile, remembering that Sky had traveled a long and difficult road just to be with him again. Sometimes, as the morning sun peeked through the window, Charles would stroke Sky's head and whisper in a trembling voice, "Thank you, my friend. Thank you for coming." Sky responded with a gentle lick on his hand, as if to say his only purpose was to be right there, by his side. In those quiet exchanges, they shared unspoken promises, both knowing that each day together was a gift they would never take for granted. Finally, the day came when the doctors announced that Charles was ready to go home. The news filled Charles's heart with joy, and even though he still needed some help to walk, he felt stronger than ever. It was finally time to return to the place they both loved, the little corner of the village that had witnessed their shared life and so many moments of peace. The morning of their departure was an emotional one for everyone at the hospital. The doctors, nurses and staff, who'd witnessed this recovery filled with love, saw them off with smiles and words of encouragement. Sky, with his tail held high and eyes shining, seemed to understand that this marked the end of a tough chapter and the beginning of a more peaceful one. As they left the hospital, Sky stayed close to Charles, matching his slow pace but staying alert with every step. The journey back to the village was calm. Along the way, Charles gazed out the window, feeling like the landscape was speaking to him in a new way. The hills, the fields, and the blue sky seemed to greet him as if they too were happy to see him back. Sky sat beside him, eyes fixed on his owner, ensuring every moment was safe and calm. When they arrived at the village, the familiar scent of the earth and the familiar sounds of home filled the air. The neighbors, who had heard of Sky's journey and his unwavering loyalty, welcomed them warmly, touched by the story. It was a long-awaited homecoming, one that everyone saw as nothing short of a miracle. Finally, after greeting the neighbors and crossing the little dirt path, Charles and Skye arrived at their home. That modest little house, surrounded by trees and wildflowers, seemed to have patiently waited for their return. Without a second thought, Skye ran to the doorstep, tail wagging with joy, then looked back at his owner as if inviting him to step inside and resume their life together. For Charles, every corner of the house held new meaning. There was something different in the air, a deep sense of gratitude for the time they still had to share. From that day forward, everything slowed down, becoming more meaningful. Walks in the fields, once routine, became special moments, with every step and every whisper of the wind echoing the journey Skye had taken. "Remember, Skye?" Charles would say softly as they walked toward the hill. "I never imagined you'd go through all that just for me. You're my hero, my friend." Skye would look up at him with loyal, loving eyes. Nothing mattered more to him than the man by his side. And in those quiet moments, they both felt they had found something beyond companionship, a bond that had only grown stronger through time and distance. As days passed, Charles dedicated more time to caring for Skye, as if each pet and every word was his way of thanking him for his loyalty. When they sat on the porch, watching the sunset, Charles would stroke Skye's fur, feeling its softness and recalling all he had risked for him. "I owe you so much, Skye. I don't know what I would have done without you," he murmured, letting his words float out like a gentle sigh, a thought spoken aloud. Skye, understanding each word, lay beside him, resting his head on Charles's lap, closing his eyes in a peaceful sign of contentment. For both of them, those quiet moments together became a refuge, a sacred space that nothing could disturb. Neighbors often saw them sitting together, unmoving, as if they found all the answers in that shared silence. Over time, Charles regained his strength, but he decided he would do nothing without Skye by his side. Every outing, each small walk to the village or the fields, became a chance to remember that life had given them a second chance. The journey Skye had undertaken alone, facing danger and solitude, was the greatest proof of love he could have received. And so, at every sunset, Charles and Skye would sit on the little hill overlooking their home and the fields. They watched the sun dip below the horizon, bathing everything in a soft golden glow. In those moments, there was no need for words. The silence was filled with understanding, gratitude, and a love that had only deepened with each step, each bark, each shared glance at just the right time. For Charles and Skye, life was no longer a simple routine. It was a gift they enjoyed together day by day, without rush, always remembering that true love could move mountains, and, in their case, cross paths, cities, and even the limits of time. The story of Skye and Charles's journey is a touching testament to the strength and loyalty that can exist between a person and their animal companion. From the start, their bond went beyond the ordinary, highlighting a relationship that needed no words to express deep, sincere love. Skye, a dog with boundless, unconditional love, embarks on a journey filled with obstacles, facing loneliness, danger, and uncertainty, all driven by the hope of reuniting with Charles, his only friend and family. This journey is truly powerful, reminding us that even in the darkest and most challenging moments, true love and determination can overcome any adversity. Skye's journey is not just a test of physical courage, but a reflection of his immense devotion and loyalty, qualities we sometimes forget to show to those we love. Along the way, Skye shows us that unconditional love can guide even the most lost and weary soul. Despite his exhaustion, he never stops or gives up, teaching us that when the purpose is noble and the love is pure, hope becomes an almost indestructible force. This story leaves us with a lesson in humanity and empathy. Through Sky, we learn about the strength of loyalty and the power of the bonds we build in life. It reminds us of the importance of caring for and protecting those we love, of being present, even in tough times. It also highlights how companionship and mutual support can be the greatest encouragement during difficult periods. In the end, the story of Sky and Charles underscores that true love and loyalty know no boundaries. They have the power to heal, inspire, and offer a second chance. It's a reminder that sometimes the strongest connections are found in shared silence, in unwavering presence, and in the promise that, no matter what, one will always be there for the other. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of your journey.